The message read, "Surprise party at Terminal 3. Dress light." She packed her shawl anyway. It had been months since Derek's first cryptic message arrived, months of short texts, vague plans and delays. Margaret wanted to believe he was reaching out, making amends. Perhaps finally her only son was ready to talk again. After 3 years of silence, even a strange invitation felt like progress. Still, something about the phrasing nagged at her. A surprise party at the airport, and why now, late afternoon light filtered through the gauze curtains as she zipped her overnight bag. Outside early winter, winds teased the skeletal branches along the driveway. She hesitated over which scarf to bring her fingers, pausing on the deep blue one Frank had given her years ago. No too sentimental. She chose the grey knit instead, wrapping it around her neck with a firmness she didn't quite feel. The taxi smelled faintly of old vinyl and mint gum. The driver, a man in his 50s, glanced at her through the mirror. "Big trip?" He asked, his tone light, but edged with curiosity. "Just a short visit," she replied, offering a polite smile. She didn't elaborate. Even if she wanted to, she wasn't sure what she'd say. That her son had summoned her to a terminal with no further details, that she was arriving more out of longing than logic. They passed through downtown traffic, the buildings casting long shadows. Margaret's mind drifted to Derek's last words to her 3 years ago. Not a word, really. A shrug, a glance at his phone, and then the front door closing quietly behind him. No goodbye, no hug, just absence. At the airport, she stepped onto the sidewalk, clutching the small box wrapped in fabric she'd brought a gift just in case. The wind bit through her coat. Her phone buzzed. Walk to gate B14. No questions. Her breath caught. No hello. No, I'm here. Just instructions. She moved forward anyway, wheeling her modest suitcase behind her. The corridors were nearly empty, only a few late travellers and an impatient janitor pushing a mop down the tile. The further she walked, the more her footsteps echoed. There were no balloons, no laughter, no surprise gathering, just sterile lighting and the distant hum of a vending machine. Then she saw it. A bench. A single old suitcase resting on it. Faded brown leather scuffed at the corners. Its latch slightly ajar. Margaret's heart pounded, not from fear exactly, but from a strange, cold anticipation. She stepped closer. The suitcase creaked as she touched it, the metal cool under her fingers. Inside, there were no clothes, no signs of travel. Just one photograph creased at the edges. Her, Derek, Frank, taken years ago in the garden, and beneath it a sheet of paper, block letters inkjet sharp. Where is the money? The rain hit her before she could turn to ask why the car had sped off. It wasn't just a drizzle. It came in sheets, relentless and cold, soaking through Margaret's coat and scarf in seconds. The taxi had barely paused near the curb before pulling away into the mist. She hadn't even seen the driver's face. She stood frozen in the half-empty parking structure of Terminal 3, the wind slicing through her like a blade. Water seeped into her shoes. Somewhere far off, the hum of engines and the crackle of airport loudspeakers echoed faintly, but all she could hear was the thud of her heart and the distant voice still ringing in her ear. "I know you have it," Derek had said moments earlier on the phone, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. "You'll give it up. You always do. No greeting. No explanation. Not even a pretense of concern. Just that quiet assumption you'll surrender because that's what you do." She clutched the soaked gift box tighter to her chest, its fabric cover sagging now with rain. The suitcase from earlier. Yes, that damned suitcase hadn't been placed there by chance. It was a message, a trap, a signal. She didn't know which yet, but it had been waiting for her. Someone wanted her to see it. And now here she was, left outside like discarded luggage. Her phone buzzed again. A second call. Derek. She stared at the screen but didn't answer. Instead, she pulled off the protective case, her fingers trembling not just from cold, but from a creeping dread. Something about the weight of it had felt wrong for weeks. She pried at the lining and found it a small, flat square tucked behind the soft plastic. No bigger than a button. A tracker. So he was watching. Every movement, every turn of her keys, every walk to the grocery store. That's why the messages had always come right after she left the house. That's how he knew when she was vulnerable. The screen lit up again. Derek calling. She powered it off. A gust of wind blew the scarf from her shoulders, sending it tumbling into a puddle. She didn't chase it. Her limbs were stiff, her mind buzzing with a strange clarity. The first sharp edges of betrayal were no longer numbing, they were slicing. That's when she saw him. Across the lot, under the overhang near the entrance to terminal security, a figure stood watching. Uniformed. Still. Not approaching, but not turning away either. The man wore a dark blue airport security jacket, a hood pulled halfway up against the rain. When their eyes met, he didn't flinch. He simply lifted his hand, not in warning, but in quiet invitation. Margaret stepped forward cautiously, her wet shoes squeaking on the concrete. "Mom?" He asked, his voice steady but gentle. "Do you need to come inside?" She hesitated. There was no menace in his tone, no judgment, just a calm presence, an anchor in a sea of chaos. She started, then faltered. "How do you explain being ambushed by your own child? How do you admit that you never really saw it coming?" She looked back once toward the shadows, where the taxi had vanished, then down at the phone in her hand, silent now. Its screen blank, but humming with all the questions that hadn't been asked. She turned back to the man and followed him toward the door. Inside, the air was dry and fluorescent and humming with machinery. Her coat dripped onto the floor, leaving small puddles behind her. He offered her a towel, then left her near a bench with a vending machine humming beside it. She sat the gift box, limp, in her lap. For the first time, the magnitude of the setup began to settle in. The suitcase, the photo, the message, the call, the tracker. None of it was spontaneous. Someone had orchestrated every step, and she, foolish and hopeful, had walked straight into it. She whispered it aloud more to herself than anyone else, her breath fogging the cold air between them. "I think I've been dropped in the middle of a hunt. This way, quickly. Cameras don't cover this corridor." The voice came low and firm from just behind her shoulder. Margaret turned sharply, her senses still frayed from the storm outside, but the man Rook was already moving ahead, a set of keys jangling softly at his hip. His blue security jacket blended with the grey walls as he led her down a narrow, half-lit hallway. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly, casting uneven shadows across stained tiles and rusted signs. The corridor smelled of damp metal and engine grease, an industrial ghost of decades past. It was the kind of place you wouldn't expect to exist beneath a modern airport, forgotten, untouched, and somehow more real than anything upstairs. And yet, it felt familiar. Not in a way Margaret could name no memory to match it, but rather like something from a dream. A bad one. The kind that clings after waking, whispering that you've been here before, but only in fear. "This used to be a backup service tunnel," Rook said, glancing back at her as they walked. "Now it's just leftovers. Doesn't connect to the main concourse anymore. Cameras stop before the junction." She followed silently, her soaked coat replaced with an oversized, dry one Rook had offered from a locker. It smelled like dust and old leather. The fabric scratched her neck, but it was warm. Overhead, the muffled voice of the terminal intercom filtered down cheerful reminders about gate changes and carry-on limits. Up there, people were buying coffee boarding flights, texting family. Down here, Margaret was stepping through shadows, away from the world she'd known. "What is this place?" she finally asked, her voice echoing strangely. Rook paused at a service panel listening. The sound of heavy boots thudded faintly in the distance. "They're still looking for you," he said quietly. "One of them radioed in, said they saw a woman matching your description near the long-term lot." Margaret's hands clenched around the gift box. Even now, it was still with her soggy crushed, but held tight. She didn't know why she hadn't dropped it. Maybe because it was the last thing she'd chosen freely today. Rook motioned to a side door. "In here." They stepped into a narrow room filled with old signage-broken chairs, a vending machine unplugged long ago. The air was thicker, cooler. Dust hung in beams of light from a cracked vent. Rook shut the door behind them and turned the lock once then again. Only then did he let himself exhale. Margaret sat slowly on a metal chair, setting the ruined box beside her. Her shoes left wet marks on the linoleum. She studied Rook in the dim light. He looked young, but not inexperienced. There was a steadiness to him, something grounded. "Who are you?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the far wall and peeled back a layer of peeling corkboard. Behind it, nailed into the concrete, was a map. Large, hand-marked paper yellowed with time. Lines ran through it like veins, service corridors, ducts, maintenance routes, emergency exits. Most were scratched out, but a few were marked in red ink. He pointed to a line that curved beneath Terminal 3 and vanished into an unmarked zone. "You're not the first one someone tried to trap here," he said quietly. The words landed heavy. She looked at him again, searching for something, maybe for a lie, maybe for a sign she'd finally lost touch with reality. But there was only calm in his expression. And something else. Regret. She stood slow but steady. The room felt tighter now, not threatening, but intimate, enclosed. As if truths were meant to be whispered here. She stepped closer and looked him in the eye. "You're not just security, are you?" The yellowed map on the wall had one word circled in red gatekeeper. Margaret stared at it, the red ink bleeding slightly into the brittle paper like blood through gauze. Everything in the room had the hush of things forgotten. Metal filing cabinets from another era, dust-streaked safety posters curling at the edges, a time clock that hadn't punched in years. "Who is that?" She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Rook didn't look up right away. He was kneeling by a dented metal locker, fiddling with a jammed hinge. No idea, he said. But someone marked it for a reason. That section of the map runs into the old sub-level back when there was a Terminal 4, decommissioned after 97. Terminal 4. The name struck her with a pang of recognition, like a half-remembered melody. Her hand hovered over the map. "My husband," she said slowly, "once told me to never go near Terminal 4. Rook glanced over. "When 10 years ago? Maybe more. He was on a call. I thought he was talking nonsense. Said something about keeping papers safe. Then later he folded up a map and tucked it into a drawer. That same night he told me don't ever go near Terminal 4. I laughed at him. She laughed now too, but it was a thin, cold sound. Rook stood and opened the next cabinet. He ever mention a gatekeeper? Margaret shook her head, then paused. No. Wait. Once. Just once. He was angry, pacing the porch. Said, "I'll take it to the gatekeeper myself if I have to." I thought it was code for a lawyer. Silence settled again. Margaret stepped away from the wall and began opening drawers. In the second file cabinet, beneath a stack of old maintenance logs and faded emergency protocols, she found a small envelope, brittle and yellowed, unsealed. She unfolded the single note inside. If found, ask for gatekeeper. He knows. Her fingers trembled slightly. Behind her, Rook muttered, "We've been cleaning this place out for years. No one's ever touched these cabinets." Margaret leaned back against the wall. Her breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of something ancient stirring. A memory not forgotten but buried. Why would my husband hide something down here, she asked mostly to herself. Maybe he wasn't hiding it. Rook replied. Maybe he was protecting it. She closed her eyes. Suddenly the air smelled different pine smoke and bourbon. Her memory took her back a winter evening. Ray sitting by the fire, folding something with care. She had come into the room, humming, carrying cocoa. He'd looked up with those soft, dark eyes and smiled, but it didn't reach the corners of his mouth. "I've taken care of it," he had said. "No one will find it unless they need to." "You don't ever need to." "What is it?" she'd asked, laughing. Ray had only shaken his head. Now, back in the musty room under the airport, she opened another folder and found a photograph. It was old, worn. A picture of her Ray and Derek as a boy, maybe 6 years old. Taken in front of the lake house they'd sold long ago. The colours had faded, but the happiness in her son's eyes hadn't. She turned it over. 12M belongs to her. Tell no one. 12 million. Belongs to her. Her hands tightened around the photographed jaw, locking against the rising tide of confusion and fury. Her did Ray mean her Margaret? Why would he leave such a message hidden in an airport sub-basement? Rook had been watching her silently. He stepped forward and gently took the photograph, reading the back. Then his eyes met hers. "Are you sure your son isn't just afraid you'll remember everything?" The same unknown number had called twice. Rook handed her the phone, silent. Margaret stared at the screen. No name, just a string of numbers, faceless, cold, deliberate. She didn't reach for it. The room they were in, the secondary server closet, buzzed softly with the low hum of aging machinery. Machines once vital to airport operations now blinked in and out of sync like fading fireflies. Dust coated the cables. No one came down here unless something broke, and even then reluctantly. "It rang twice," Rook said. "That's not an accident." Margaret said nothing, but inside her something tightened. The tone of the ring, sharp and clinical, echoed the voice that had haunted her earlier. "You always do what I want." That voice didn't belong to Rook. It didn't belong to the stranger in the hallway. It belonged to her son. The phone buzzed again, just once, and went dark. "They're pinging it," Rook murmured. He opened a cabinet and pulled out an old terminal, tapping quickly, triangulating off old cell towers. Someone's tracing it every time it rings. Margaret's hands clenched unconsciously. "So they know we're here?" "They will in a minute. We need to move." But Margaret stood still. "Let me see the camera feed again." Rook hesitated, then brought up the black and white monitor. It scrolled through grainy angles, empty maintenance halls, storage closets, flickering stairwells. Then one frame froze her breath. A man in a black suit was walking slowly through Corridor E, not far from where they'd entered the tunnel system. His hair slicked back, his eyes unreadable, his pace unhurried, like someone with all the time in the world. Margaret had seen him before. Not here. Not now, at Ray's funeral. He hadn't spoken that day, hadn't approached the casket or offered condolences. He'd just stood by the hedge, sunglasses on, as if waiting for someone else to make a move. Her chest tightened. That's not Derek, she said quietly. Rook narrowed his eyes. You sure I'm sure? Rook flicked through other feeds. The man didn't appear again. But Margaret already knew he wasn't chasing. He was waiting. Derek's not doing this alone, she said. He never had the patience for plans. Rook nodded slowly. And this is a plan. He crossed to the far side of the room and opened a crate sealed with brittle packing tape. Inside were remnants of an older-era manual's ID cards, security tags. Margaret turned her attention to the duffel bag in the corner, the one she'd carried unknowingly from the parking lot. She hadn't opened it since the rain. Now she did. Inside wasn't what she expected. The photograph lay on top again, her Ray and Derek as a child. That image was beginning to feel like an omen. She picked it up and froze. The corner of the frame scratched. It hadn't been like that before. She searched the bag more carefully now. Tucked in a side pocket wrapped in wax paper was a second envelope, inside a key, and a tag. Locker 417, Terminal 4. Her stomach dropped. This bag, she whispered. It wasn't Derek's. Rook looked over. What this belonged to Ray. He must have left it for me. And someone switched it. Someone wanted me to find it. But not too soon. She looked back at the darkened phone still in Rook's hand. It buzzed once more, then went still. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Someone wants me found, she said softly. But not by my son. No cameras down here, Rook said. But it's not the safest route. Margaret didn't hesitate. She had hesitated too many times in her life. The shaft yawned before them, narrow-ribbed with rust, its metal walls lined with old screw tracks and flaking insulation. It smelled of forgotten machinery and water left standing too long. The purple line on the old map had ended here, marked simply, Emergency Protocol. Rook crouched first, testing the edge with his boot. We'll need to crawl part of the way. It drops into an old medical transfer duct. Wasn't meant for people. I've been through worse, Margaret said, gripping the rail and lowering herself down. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Inside the shaft, swallowed sound. Each movement echoed strangely, ricocheting off the metal like whispers in a vault. The air turned colder the farther they went. Margaret's knees ached as she crawled, hands scraping along ridged surfaces. She winced once, feeling skin split along her palm. The damp metal was unforgiving. You all right? Rook asked from ahead. I've bled for worse, she muttered, wrapping her hand quickly with the handkerchief from her coat pocket. The cloth stained quickly, but the feel of it in her hand froze her breath. She knew this fabric. It wasn't just hers. It was his. Ray's. She hadn't thought about it in years. That old handkerchief he always folded neatly and kept in his breast pocket, even when it was no longer fashionable. He called it his lucky charm. Margaret had teased him endlessly about it, called it a banker's security blanket. She unwrapped it slightly, trying to see through the dark. The edge was frayed, worn down from years of use, but stitched faintly in the seam was a line of hand-embroidered letters. Trust no one. Her mouth went dry. It wasn't just a keepsake. She paused in the shaft, breath shallow. The metal pressed around her like a cage. Behind her eyes, memory flickered. Ray sitting at the dining table late at night, papers spread out before him. He had been mumbling half to himself, half to her, as he scribbled on the back of a bank contract. They'll never look under the ground, he'd said. That's where I hid the real signature. At the time, she thought he meant hiding documents in a safe. But now she wondered if he had meant exactly what he said. Beneath. Always beneath. The crawl space narrowed again, forcing her to slide sideways. A jagged bolt scraped her elbow, and she hissed in pain. The handkerchief pressed against her ribs. Its weight suddenly meant more than cloth and blood. Rook had stopped ahead, holding up a hand. Vent ahead. Old intake filter. Leads into the back of Terminal 4's decommissioned baggage zone. How much farther? She asked, pushing herself beside him. He didn't answer right away. You're bleeding. She looked down. Her coat sleeve was stained. I'm fine. You didn't have to come this way, he said quietly. You could have stayed hidden. Let someone else run this. Margaret met his eyes in the dim. I spent a lifetime letting others decide what I could or couldn't handle. I'm not hiding anymore. She shifted forward, sliding past him toward the grate. Each push forward, each sting of skin and breathless lurch felt like peeling back old fears, old passivity. She'd walked blindly into her son's manipulation because she had trusted too easily. But now she had Ray's words. Trust no one. He had known. Not just about Derek, about everything. At the edge of the shaft, they paused. Rook unlatched the vent with care. Cool air flooded in from the dark chamber beyond. The space was cavernous, quiet, abandoned conveyor belts, and ghostly stacks of unclaimed bins. Before slipping through, Margaret tightened the bloodied handkerchief in her hand and whispered, I think he knew I'd be hunted. He was older than Margaret expected, and far less surprised to see her. The man sat at a narrow bench, turning the tiny gears of an antique clock with tweezers that looked too delicate for his large, weathered hands. Dust motes danced in the thin beam of light that crept through a slatted vent high on the wall. The room hidden beneath what once was the radar tower thrummed faintly with power, not from the outside world, but from something older, rooted private. Rook cleared his throat. Lucas Quinn. The man didn't look up. Took you long enough. Margaret stepped forward, unsure whether to speak first. Her fingers were still curled tightly around the handkerchief, blood dried now, a stiff brown edge to the fabric. The faint sting in her hand kept her alert present. Lucas finally glanced up. His eyes, though dulled by age, locked onto hers with unsettling precision. Margaret Ellis. It wasn't a question. You knew my husband, she said quietly. I built his shadows, Lucas replied gently, setting down the clock mechanism. And you're the reason he built his escape route. She blinked. What he told me, if anything ever happened, if the boy turned, to wait for you. Not instructions, not papers. You. The silence that followed was heavy. Rook shifted beside her but said nothing. Margaret stepped further into the room. It smelled of oil, solder, and something else, time maybe, or loss. On the walls hung schematics layers of folded maps, old ID badges from airport staff, long retired or forgotten. A whole world underground. Lucas reached below the table and produced a metal case the size of a paperback. He opened it gently, revealing a sleek black device nestled in protective foam. Its surface shimmered slightly, covered in fine etchings that looked more ceremonial than technological. He called it the Legacy Key, Lucas said. Encrypted drive, biometrics only, voice and eyes. Margaret stared at it. Mine, yours, he nodded. He calibrated it with footage from your wedding, your laugh, your old voicemail greeting. Took months. She stepped closer, heart pounding. There it was, the thing Derek wanted the ghost Ray had left behind. Her face, her voice. Her existence was the only way to unlock it. Inside, Lucas continued, are the pass-throughs, redirects, the core of Ray's offshore holdings hidden beneath layers of dummy shells. 12 million, maybe more now, all rerouted to a structure that leads to you. Margaret's breath caught. 12 million. 12 million she hadn't asked for. 12 million that Derek believed was his birthright. You'll need to read a line into it, Lucas said. We'll test that later. But if you fail, if the calibration fails, you only get one more attempt before it locks for good. Margaret touched the metal. It was cool too light for its gravity. Why me? She asked, voice trembling slightly. Lucas gave a small, sad smile. Because he knew you'd never seek it. And that's what made you worthy. Behind them, Rook shifted. What about Derek Lucas's face hardened? If Derek finds the second key, the override, this entire system crashes. The money, the records, the trail, all of it goes to dust. Margaret looked up sharply. Second key. Ray had a failsafe, just in case. A final signature. He never told me where it was. Margaret's mind raced. A second key. Could Derek have it? Or someone else entirely? The device pulsed faintly like a sleeping heartbeat. She realized something then, that all the corridors, all the pain, had led her not just to survival, but to a moment of power. She held the legacy key in both hands, and suddenly, for the first time in days, she felt steady. The code, Lucas said, is a sentence only you and Ray would remember. The door to the old data core hissed open, revealing a space long untouched by time or relevance. Fluorescent lights flickered above like memories trying to relight themselves. The air smelled faintly of melted plastic and dust. In one corner, half concealed behind a discolored wooden panel, was the safe mechanical, unadorned and waiting. Margaret stood in front of it, her breath catching. On the screen above the keypad, red letters glowed voice code required, phrase of intimacy. She glanced at Lucas, who stood quietly by the door. He didn't offer help, didn't blink. It wasn't his memory to unlock. Her mouth was dry. She stepped forward. I miss you, she said gently. Beep. Denied. She tried again. The ranch. Beep. Denied. Her fingers curled. She remembered Ray's voice, calm and heavy, whispering across the years, like a leaf skimming water. He's not ready, she tried. Beep. Denied. Margaret closed her eyes. She was trembling not from fear, but from the sharpness of memory pressing in. It was Christmas Eve. Years ago. Ray had built a small fire in the fireplace, even though the central heating worked fine. He poured her tea with both hands, always careful, always precise. That night, after the laughter faded and Derek went to bed, Ray had sat beside her, silent for a long time. Then he leaned in and whispered, "One day, this silence will protect you." She opened her eyes. The words found her not from memory, but from the hollow of her chest where love had once lived. She leaned in. "Only silence can't be faked," she whispered. The room paused. Click. The door to the safe creaked open. Inside, a weathered folder sat atop an envelope sealed in wax. Margaret reached in slowly. Her hands didn't tremble now. They moved like someone who had earned each step. She opened the folder first. Bank statements, legal account routing numbers, asset titles, and a folded sheet of paper, handwritten. Last will and testament of Raymond Ellis. Her heart swelled and sank all at once. She'd never seen this version. It named her only her as the sole custodian of all assets held in trust for her own use discretion and legacy. Derek's name was nowhere. There was a note scribbled in the corner, not in legal ink, but in Ray's familiar scrawl. Don't let guilt become inheritance. Love doesn't entitle cruelty. Tears didn't come. Not yet. At the bottom of the stack, a scan of a notarized document caught her eye. It bore Derek's signature. Power of attorney. Margaret's breath caught. She never signed one. And yet the document declared she had granted full financial and medical authority to her son, dated just 6 weeks before Ray's death. The edges of the scan were cropped, as if something had been removed. She looked up, her voice barely audible. Someone forged me. Lucas stepped forward, his face unreadable. Now you understand why you were meant to come here alone. Margaret stared at the pages, a rising clarity sharpening her focus. This wasn't just about inheritance, it was about erasure. Margaret ran her fingers along the paper's edge. This is not my signature. The room was small, barely wider than her wingspan, but it held a fax machine, an ancient computer, and one dusty window overlooking a stretch of windswept fields. The radar tower moaned faintly above them, a mechanical breath that hadn't stopped in decades. Outside, the world looked empty. Inside, her world narrowed into ink paper and betrayal. Lucas leaned over the terminal, adjusting the scanner's light. You said you've never signed this. Margaret shook her head, not knowingly, and not with that hand. He fed the document through, slow and careful. The system, outdated but functional, blinked to life and began comparing. Lines, loops, pressure points. The result appeared after a moment: match probability 42%. Signature inconsistency detected. Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out a tax form from 5 years ago, a hospital consent form, an old birthday card, all in her careful, slanted handwriting, never too firm, always deliberate. This one, she whispered, pointing at the forged document, was done with arrogance, not memory. Lucas frowned. You think he did this himself? She exhaled long and low. The date, she murmured, scanning the header. It's the day I had the stroke. I remember the way the light flickered in my hospital room, the smell of antiseptic. But I don't remember signing anything. Lucas checked the timestamp. Afternoon. 2:37 p.m. Margaret sat back. That was when I couldn't move my right arm. My son came to visit. Lucas didn't speak right away. Then quietly, he didn't just want your money. He erased your consent. The words landed like stones dropped into a still lake. No ripples, just weight. Margaret's fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. She didn't cry. That part of her soft, hopeful had been left somewhere between Terminal 3 and the old service shaft. I want to speak, she said finally, not to defend myself, but to remember on record, so no one can erase this again. The radio on Lucas's belt crackled. Rook's voice burst through, tight with urgency. Movement on the north path. Someone in a knit cap, closing in fast. Margaret turned to the window. A figure, distant but deliberate, moved along the fence line. Too straight. Too purposeful. Lucas reached for a lever on the floor. There's another exit. It'll take you through the radio base's maintenance crawl. Margaret didn't move. She looked at the document one last time, then folded it with precise care. This time she said, I'm not running. I'm remembering. That's what he feared. Rook's voice crackled louder, sharper. We have to go. Now. He said you'd never remember, the woman whispered. But I was there. The fog clung to the metal skin of the old radar station like a secret not yet spoken. Margaret stood near the side entrance, her breath, visible fingers tightening around the folded document in her coat pocket. Behind her, the steady thrum of machinery kept time with her heartbeat, both slow, steady, uncertain. A silhouette moved through the mist. Margaret Elwood, the voice asked, unsure. Margaret froze. That name hadn't been used since before Ray, since before the ranch. She turned. A woman in her 40s wearing a threadbare coat and carrying a worn satchel stepped into view. Her face was tired, lips dry, but her eyes grey and searching were firm. I'm Ava. Ava Moreno. I was. I helped care for you when you were admitted. After the stroke. Lucas, standing near the door's edge, gave a slight nod. Rook had cut the external feed for 3 minutes, no more. Margaret didn't speak, but she didn't walk away either. Ava stepped closer. I shouldn't be here. I left the system years ago. Too many things I wasn't allowed to say. Why now? Margaret asked, her voice hoarse. Because I remember what no one else does. Inside the small storage room, they sat across from each other on overturned crates. Dust floated in shafts of light from a single hanging bulb. Outside, the fog thickened, hiding the world. Ava reached into her satchel and pulled out a plastic envelope. That day when you were admitted, you weren't responsive. Derek came in, said he needed to handle insurance paperwork. Margaret listened still. He had something folded. He placed it in your hand. Told you, just sign it, Mum. I'll take care of the rest. You weren't awake. Not really. But your hand moved weakly. Then he guided it. Margaret's jaw clenched. I wasn't supposed to intervene, Ava continued, voice tight. But when he left, I found something on the floor. A torn piece corner of the same paper, I think. It had a smudge. I had it tested years ago. She opened the envelope. Inside was a jagged piece of paper, part of a printed signature line. Above it, faintly visible, a fingerprint in dry red. I thought it was ink, Ava said, but I remembered. You had a nosebleed that day. Blood pressure spike. Margaret stared at the fragment. That day returned in fragments, bright lights, a taste of metal in her mouth. Ray's photo on the hospital table. It's mine, she said. That's my blood. Ava nodded. And that means it happened while you were out of control, not consenting. Margaret felt a surge, quiet but undeniable. Not rage. Something colder. Certainty. She took the paper gently, like one would hold an old scar. Then Ava added almost too softly, but there's something else. Margaret looked up. I wasn't alone. Someone came with Derek. He didn't speak, just stood at the door in a brown coat. When he laughed once, it startled me. She paused. He had your husband's voice. He's using Ray's voice, Margaret murmured, but Ray's been gone for years. The room was dim, lit only by the faint green glow of an old recording device resting on the table. Dust floated through the stale air like suspended time. The carpet was worn from years of pacing, and the walls bore the faint marks of once-framed memories. Margaret sat alone, the hard plastic headphones pressing against her ears as she rewound another tape marked simply Sunday morning. Ray's voice emerged, warm, familiar, hesitant. You'll know what to do when the time comes. She exhaled shakily. That line, it had always comforted her. Until now. Rook leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. That's the fifth one, he said. They all match. Same vocal cadence, same grain. I know, Margaret replied, not looking up, but this one doesn't. She slid a different cassette into the player. It clicked into place with a reluctant snap. Then a voice, colder, clipped, yet unmistakably Ray. Don't let her have it? Margaret flinched. Rook raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound right. Lucas, standing by the shelf of aging equipment, turned his head slightly. Play it again. They listened. 3 times. Each time the words hit harder. That phrase, Margaret whispered, he never said anything like that. Not to me. Not even during our worst fights. Rook pulled out his phone, running the file through an app he had once used for field analysis. Formant shifts. Timing is tight. But here. He pointed. 6% variation in sibilance. Slight shift in glottal stops. It's not him. Or at least, not naturally him. Deep fake, Lucas asked. Rook nodded. Synthetic blend, maybe. Someone used archived recordings and stitched new meaning into old sounds. Margaret's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. Her chest felt hollow, not from grief this time, but from something more insidious, betrayal, layered on illusion. "I heard that voice once," she said slowly. "In the hospital. I wasn't fully awake. Derek played something to me. I thought I was hallucinating. I thought Ray had turned against me." Lucas stepped forward. "Then that voice didn't just steal Ray's sound, it hijacked your memory." Silence hung between them. Margaret walked to the dusty file cabinet, and retrieved the encrypted hard drive Lucas had given her 2 nights before. She connected it to the old terminal. A list of folders blinked onto the screen. Then a new entry appeared, time-stamped just minutes ago, redacted last voice of Ray. No one had touched the drive. No one. Rook stared at the file. That shouldn't be there. Margaret hovered her cursor over it, her hands steady now. Her eyes, once damp with disbelief, were dry and sharp. She didn't open the file. Not yet. Instead, she whispered to herself, "If someone made a god out of his voice, what else have they made of me?" The ranch wasn't just land. It was a vault, a map, a maze. Margaret stepped into the cellar, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust that blanketed the narrow staircase. A low bulb dangled from a frayed cord above, casting golden rings of light on the concrete floor. The air smelled of cedar and oil, a scent Ray had always loved, one he said reminded him of things that last. Lucas followed close behind, flashlight in hand. "Are you sure this is it?" he asked, scanning the room. "I used to hear him down here for hours," Margaret replied. He said it was where things made sense. The cellar was larger than she remembered, half storage, half workshop. Old drafting tables sat against the wall, rolled maps tucked into tubes, dusty, but labelled in Ray's neat block handwriting. A row of mechanical tools lined one shelf, untouched for years, but meticulously ordered. Rook descended last, pausing at the foot of the stairs. He looked around, more alert than ever. "Let's make it quick. We don't know how far Derek's reach goes." Margaret crossed the room to the central workbench. There, beneath a protective sheet, lay a large map of the ranch. Not a modern satellite image, but a hand-drawn schematic room by room, outbuilding by outbuilding, with small red markings and timestamps: 7:43 a.m., barn loft, 12:12 p.m., west tree line. He recorded everything she whispered, his own movement, his patterns. Lucas leaned in. "These aren't just times. They're intervals. Look at the gable ends. See the tiles." Rook squinted. "They alternate every third section," Morse Lucas said simply. They moved to the far corner where loose floor tiles had shifted with time. Lucas traced the patterns with a gloved finger. T-H-E-R-E-A-L. He murmured. Margaret stood back, her breath caught. "The real vault," she finished. "Not the one in the barn's safe." Lucas found the sequence 23-17-06, an old land coordinate system once used for regional land grants. He opened a drawer in the bench and pulled out an aged index. It matched the numbers to the exact location of the original ranch deed, just beneath the warehouse's eastern post. With Rook's help, they pried up the flooring. Underneath lay a shallow cavity sealed with a steel lid. No lock, just weight. Inside was a thin metal case, velvet-lined. Margaret lifted it gently. Within, a polished titanium title card embossed. "Property claimed. Not yet transferred. Owner Margaret Ann Pierce." She stared at it, at her own name etched in steel. Her knees weakened, but she didn't fall. Lucas exhaled slowly. "No one can fake that. Not in this jurisdiction. That's pre-digital legal encoding." Ray knew what he was doing. Margaret brushed the edge of the card with her thumb. He never trusted banks, but he trusted this house. And me. Suddenly, from above, a faint creak. Rook froze. Upstairs. They exchanged glances. The quiet kind, before storms. Another step. Closer now. Then silence. "I suggest you lawyer up," Margaret said, her voice soft as dusk. "Because I just did." The scent of old paper and cedar filled the office. Margaret sat at the edge of the chair, her posture calm, but anchored, like a woman who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Across from her, Nora Ung, mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair tied in a low knot, skimmed through the documents spread out before them. Her glasses slipped slightly as she leaned closer. "You've done half my job already," Nora said, tapping the scan of the forged power of attorney. Fake signature, irregular notary timestamp, and a partial fingerprint with visible hemoglobin residue. That alone is enough to begin. Margaret nodded. "He thought I'd forget everything, but Ray left pieces everywhere. He knew I'd find them." Lucas stood by the door, silent, his arms crossed. Rook waited outside in the car, scanning movement. This wasn't a hiding place, it was a launch pad. Nora flipped through the folder again, then pulled a legal pad closer. "We'll file an emergency motion to freeze any assets currently under Derek's control, pending full review. Given the signature irregularities and the biometric proof, we have a strong basis. We'll also file a civil claim for elder abuse and asset manipulation." Margaret looked out the window. A single bird flitted past, disappearing behind the trees. Her voice was low. "I want this to be done right. No screaming, no drama. Just justice." At 2:00 p.m., Derek arrived. He wore a slate-grey suit, no tie. His expression was smooth, almost amused, as if he'd expected a scolding, maybe even a plea for reconciliation. He didn't expect Margaret to be sitting at the far end of the long wooden table, her hands, folded eyes steady. "Mother," he greeted, smiling faintly. Mr. Pierce. Nora replied instead, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "You are hereby served." Derek hesitated, the smile faltering. Margaret spoke without venom. "This isn't revenge. It's restoration." He opened the envelope, eyes scanning the dense legal language, the list of attached exhibits. When he reached the copy of the bank account transfer, dated 3 years earlier, with Ray's original signature, and Margaret as sole beneficiary, his hands stiffened. He looked up. "Where did you get this?" Nora answered. "From the man who built the vault underneath your family ranch. And from your mother, who never stopped remembering what mattered." Derek tried to mask the tremor in his voice. "You don't know what you're starting." Margaret leaned forward just slightly. "I'm not starting anything. I'm finishing it." He stood abruptly, but Nora remained composed. "You have 10 days to respond, or we proceed to court." "You were never supposed to outlive your silence," Derek hissed. The sky hung low over the ranch, thick with grey clouds. Wind stirred dead leaves around the gnarled roots of the old apple tree, the one Ray used to prune every spring. Its bark had turned pale and cracked like forgotten paper. Margaret stood near it, her shawl pinned at the shoulders, face turned into the breeze. Derek walked toward her, footsteps sharp on the gravel path. His expression was twisted, not with grief, but something older, more brittle. Betrayal. "You set all this up," he spat. "A trap. You had help." "I had memories," Margaret said. "You tried to erase them. I refused." He laughed without mirth. "What are you planning now? Take everything back?" "You're 70, Mother. 70. What are you going to do with 12 million? Plant more flowers?" She didn't flinch. "Remind you what dignity looks like?" Derek's jaw clenched. "You want to stand there and pretend you didn't ruin everything?" Margaret's voice stayed calm. No, I stood by while you ruined yourself. That's different. You don't understand, he snapped. You never fought for anything. You just endured. And you expected me to do the same. I expected you to be decent. Silence dropped between them like a blade. He stepped closer. You don't deserve what he left. You barely spoke up for yourself. You always hid in your books, your garden, your silence. She met his eyes. And yet, here I am, still standing. He shook his head. He should have left it all to me. I earned it. I took care of him. Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to him, fingers steady. What's this? A letter, she said. Your father wrote it. The day before he died. He never had the courage to give it to you. Derek tore it open. As his eyes moved across the page, the colour drained from his face. Margaret spoke gently. He trusted me, not because I was loud, but because I was constant. Ray's words on the page were simple. If you're reading this, and Margaret has found her way to the truth, then good, because she's the only one I trust to carry on what we built. Derek's hands shook. He gave it to you. He left it hidden, just like everything else he wanted me to find. From the edge of the tree line, Lucas watched quietly, a small camera tucked inside his coat lens, blinking red once every few seconds. Rook stood behind the fence, saying nothing. Derek's face contorted. His eyes, red wet, flashed. This isn't over. You want war? Margaret looked up at the sky. I want peace. He stepped back. You'll have war. He turned, fists clenched, and stormed back toward his car. This is the last time I'll speak of it, Margaret said calmly. Let the record show I was never gone. The hearing room was modest wood-panelled walls, a low ceiling, and the distant hum of an old heating system. At the far end sat a panel of 3, a probate judge, a legal welfare officer, and a state-appointed elder rights coordinator. To their left, the court recorder's fingers hovered over a keyboard. No press, no gallery, just the necessary. Margaret sat upright, unflinching. Nora beside her passed no notes. Margaret had asked to speak for herself. Across the table, Derek slumped in a chair, lips tight, eyes flickering with restrained rage. Lucas stood in the back, hands folded. Rook leaned against the wall near the exit alert, but unobtrusive. Margaret began. Her voice didn't tremble. I was invited to an airport, she said. Not by kindness, but by deceit. I found a suitcase. Inside it, a photo and a question. Where is the money? The panel listened. She continued laying out the trail, how she had uncovered the chip in her phone, the hidden maps, the voice recordings designed to manipulate her trust. Each step recounted not with bitterness, but precision. She made it clear her silence had never meant ignorance. Lucas stepped forward. With permission, he said, This is footage recorded 3 days ago. A small screen was wheeled in. The video played Derek's voice, loud, spiteful. You were never supposed to outlive your silence. Margaret didn't flinch. Derek, hearing himself, turned red. This woman, Nora added, was being hunted. Financially, emotionally, psychologically. But she documented everything. She presented the biometric report, fingerprint evidence, the bloodied power of attorney fragment with partial DNA match, the property map, labelled in Ray's own handwriting. And then, the final blow, a restored audio file from Ray's original message. If Margaret is not there, nothing goes forward. She is the anchor. Derek rose. That could be fake. That could be... The judge raised a hand. Mr. Pierce, please remain seated. Margaret turned her head. He tried to erase me. Not just from paper. From memory. From what I built with my husband. She paused. He doesn't need me. but I will not allow him to erase who I am and what Ray and I built together. Silence followed. Heavy. Real. The elder rights officer nodded slowly. This is no longer just a case of inheritance. It is one of personal erasure. The judge conferred briefly with the others, then turned to the room. Pending full review, the court hereby orders a temporary freeze on all disputed assets. Mrs. Margaret Pierce will retain full provisional control until a final ruling is issued. The apple tree hadn't bloomed in years, but this morning a single white blossom opened against the blue sky. Margaret sat on the porch, hands folded loosely in her lap, the cool breeze brushing against her cheeks. The sun was gentle, no longer piercing like winter's light, but soft like memory. Birds chirped not urgently, but as if simply greeting another ordinary, undramatic day. The ranch was quiet again. No hearings, no documents, no shadows behind trees. Just Margaret Ava planting spring flowers along the walkway, and the sound of wind catching the old wind chime Ray had once hung near the fence. Ava stood and stretched. "Want me to trim back the hedge today?" Margaret shook her head with a smile. "Let it grow wild for once. I think it's earned that." Inside, the mail sat unopened, but on top was a cream envelope, hand-addressed Pierce v. Pierce. Final hearing scheduled 90 days. Margaret read it, nodded, and placed it on the side table without comment. "I don't need to rush any more," she murmured. "Time isn't the threat it used to be." Ava brought her a small wooden frame. Inside, the photograph of Ray young and smiling now included a handwritten inscription. For M, who remembered when no one else did. Margaret touched the glass lightly, not as if mourning, but as if affirming. She set it beside her teacup and leaned back. From across the field, a boy from the neighbouring farm ran up, waving a small foil-wrapped package. "My grandma says you helped my daddy fix the boundary wall. She told me to bring this." Margaret smiled as he placed the biscuit bundle in her hand. "Thank you, sweetheart." "You're like Grandma M now," he said, grinning before darting back toward the fence. She watched him disappear, then opened a leather-bound notebook. On the first page, dated simply today, she wrote, "I live again, under my own name." A breeze stirred. Behind her, the screen door eased shut with a gentle clack. The house no longer felt like a vault. It breathed with her now. As she stood and walked toward the garden, she paused near the old tree. The branches were thin, dry, but right at the bend where Ray used to rest his hand, a single white bloom fluttered in the wind. She smiled. Not wide, just enough. The woman who was once abandoned at an airport in the rain now sits quietly beneath the tree that finally bloomed. She didn't fight to punish, but to be remembered right with evidence, not sentiment. Justice may arrive late, but it resonates like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody. Sometimes it only takes one voice, calm, unshaken, to undo years of silence. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.